Hello, so I'm going to try and make a video explaining via Negativa and that, or the Apothatic way, which basically means the same thing, and the via Positiva is the Cataphatic way, I believe. Yeah, so Apothatic is the via Negativa, Cataphatic is the via Positiva, and what via Negativa basically means is well, it's predicated on the assumption that we can't adequately explain God using positive attributes, and that's because we don't necessarily know exactly what God is, but we can almost get close to a definition of God by saying what God isn't. And you can see this in many of his attributes. Like, for example, I've got some brought down here. So, invisible, impassible, which means he cannot suffer, ineffable, which means he cannot be described, immortal, can't die, immaterial or intangible, immutable, unchanging, infinite, and incomprehensible, so he cannot be understood. Now, all of these words, they don't necessarily tell us anything about... One minute. There we go. They don't necessarily tell us anything about what God is, but they tell us what God isn't, so it sort of allows us to... It's like understanding by deduction or something like that. But you can criticise this view because, well, people say that it actually brings you quite close to atheism. The fact that you're saying, well, what's the difference between an invisible, impassible, ineffable, immortal, immutable, incomprehensible being and nothing? That's an argument that atheists will make, and even some theists perhaps who aren't so fond of the idea of the apophatic way. Okay, there's a quote here by W. Chalmers Smith. It says, "Immortal, invisible God, only wise, in light, inaccessible, hidden from our eyes." Okay. So this is saying that God is essentially nothing, but it says he's wise. Don't know. He's invisible. We can't see him, but he's there. Defining God using negative words is known as via Negativa. Hindu theory similarly keeps repeating the phrase neti neti, which means not that, to make the same point. Muslim philosophers developed the double negative. God is not a being, but he's also not a non-being. They are also trying to express the mystery of God. I know a lot of atheists get a bit annoyed when you say that, oh, God acts in mysterious ways in a response to perhaps the suffering of children with bone cancer or the multiple different evils which are occurring in the world, and it's like, oh, God acts in mysterious ways. It's like, isn't that sort of a cop-out? It's like you're just really getting God off the hook there by saying that he acts in mysterious ways, perhaps because you believe there's some afterlife which is going to justify all of this terrible suffering on earth, which perhaps is the case, but I don't know. Can you portray God via images? Okay, well, a lot of religions are against the idea of portraying God via images because they say it's blasphemy and they believe it's offensive. Another, I think it was Hinduism. Yeah, Hindus, they actually have multiple gods, and they do portray those gods via images, but I believe it's like all of these different gods are an attempt to point to this one God. So it's like, and they just sort of accept the fact that they know that people know that God can't be represented in images, and that these aren't the actual thing. They're just almost like signs which point towards the transcendent. Yeah, and also in the Roman Catholic tradition, the Sistine Chapel has God portrayed in Michelangelo's painting. So there's another example of that. Geometric patterns, symmetry, patterns, beauty. So these are more like art. It's not necessarily words, but it's still language, and people believe that you can use images to as a sign almost, which points beyond the image itself. So it's like, if you point at something in the distance, it's not your finger that that is the subject of the pointing is something out there that you can't necessarily get to completely because it's too far away. You're just pointing at it, so you shouldn't take the sign as a mistake for, or mistake the sign for the thing itself. You should just look at it as in something which is trying to transcend, and this is how people perceive images. It's not the thing itself. It's almost like a bridge, trying to take us to that thing that it's been pointed at, and in this case, I guess it's God. Okay. There is a danger that images may themselves be venerated rather than pointing beyond themselves. The stylish art of Eastern Orthodox iconography very deliberately points to significance rather than likeness. This is art created from prayer for prayer. Both words and pictures try to point beyond themselves to what is ultimately inexpressible. So that's saying that God's inexpressible, therefore no matter how much language or how much pictures we use, it's never going to take us the full mile. Okay, in short, God being what he is, the infinitely inexpressible, we can only talk about him indirectly and at a remove. Our words and ideas are only stand-ins for a reality which is always beyond us. Our symbols, signs, metaphors and images are not to be thought of as anything more than symbols, signs, metaphors and images. They only point to God, and put us in touch with God, lead to God. They should never be confused with the unfathomable reality of God himself. So that's like what I was saying, that the signs pointing towards something. And yeah, it's not. You shouldn't look at it as if it's the thing in itself. You should look at it as something which is pointing to something else, which is God. Okay. The Via Negativa sees all religious language as equivocal, which means it uses the same words but with it's got a different meaning. And okay, so I'll try and explain that a little bit. If you think of the word tank, it can be used in multiple different contexts, but it has a completely different meaning. For example, there's a fish tank and an army tank. Those two things aren't the same meaning of word, but it's the same word. So if we think about this in the context of God, we say God is good, right? But goodness is relative to the species almost, or to, I don't want to say to the individual, but I want to say I'll stick to the species. So what is good for a human isn't what's good for a plant or what's good for an animal. So there's a reference to Aristotle there with his hierarchy of souls, I believe, with the vegetative, locomotive and human. And then I think Aristotle actually put God at the top of that, but I can't remember. So yeah. Anyway, so when we say God is good, we don't necessarily mean that God is good, because the religious language is equivocal. It could mean something a lot different, and it probably does, because God has a different nature to what we have. So we can't assume that when we say good, we know exactly what that means in terms of God, because we can't understand it from God's perspective. We can only understand it from the human perspective. We're confined to our own experience. Okay, this may seem... Okay, so the Via Negativa sees all religious language as equivocal. This may seem sceptical or atheistic, but it is a characteristic view of those in the mystical traditions. In the West, it goes back to the thinking of Plato, who emphasised the one or the good, who is beyond all categorical language and thought. Okay, and he added a little bit of writing about what Plato believed God was, and I think he called the God the demiurge, or demiurgian, or something like that. And he basically believed that it was was he an impersonal being? I don't think. Okay, well, it was a being who created the universe from pre-existent matter, and Plato believed that matter was inherently imperfect, and so there must have been some sort of soul which pre-existed beforehand in order to be able to bring about this world. And because matter is inherently flawed, that can also, I guess, be an excuse for the suffering in the world, because all things that are material are imperfect. Therefore, we can never have a perfect world. We can never reach a state of perfection in the material world, and we will often come face to face with our demise on many levels of this existence. Okay. The ascent to the One lies in the imageless or apothatic type of meditation. One quiets oneself, getting rid of the lowest and moving to the higher. This is one quiet. What? One quiets oneself, getting rid of the lowest and moving to the higher. That is, one quiets first the body, then the words and thoughts of the mind, opening up the possibility of the unmediated encounter with the One. What is usually emphasized is that this experience is ineffable and indescribable, yet intensely real and the most real one experience one can have. Okay, so here I guess it's making a reference to religious experience, and it's saying that when you have a religious experience, perhaps from the result of meditation or I guess here it's talking about meditation or perhaps some form of prayer. It's unmediated. You don't have to use language or some form of symbol in order to be able to bridge that gap. It's like a direct connection to the transcendent. And okay, I understand this here because I've had these sorts of experiences before, and I don't want to have the baggage of saying that this was God, because obviously, what the hell is God? I still struggle to get my head around that. Like, I don't necessarily want to create a straw man out of God. I don't want to have the wrong idea, because I know that God means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But yeah, I mean, I have my own prejudices, and but I understand where this is coming from, and perhaps this is what people have always meant by God. It was more of a feeling of connectedness or something like that, and I don't know. I won't get too deep into speculating that anyway. Okay, we arrive, according to Dionysius, at a complete absence of discourse and intelligibility. The attempt to say what God is not is usually an attempt to not to misrepresent him. Those who talk about God in terms of what he is not emphasize his unknowability. Okay, so that's basically saying that Via Negativa is good because it doesn't pin God down to a label, because we don't necessarily know what God is, because he's unintelligible and unknowable. Therefore, whenever we say what God is, we sort of have to accept that we're perhaps wrong. There's a possibility that we're mistaken in a lot of ways. Okay, mysticism and the Via Negativa. 1 minute. Okay, got distracted, right? Mysticism and the Via Negativa. Many mystics, such as Saint John of the Cross, believe it is possible to talk about God by not saying what he is, but by saying what he is not. As mystical experience is ineffable, as William James said, mystics resort to saying what God is not. The Via Negativa was recognised by Saint Augustine, key scholar I need to remember, and Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite. Every positive quality attributed to God must be balanced by the recognition that human language is inadequate. We can link that to Wittgenstein, who talked about language games and how, later Wittgenstein, if we're going to be precise, because early Wittgenstein thought that that you can say anything clearly, whereas later Wittgenstein recognised the ambiguity of language and saw the meanings change based on the context. And obviously, if the meanings are changing from words, and we don't even necessarily know what God is, and we're trying to use language to explain him, then there's obviously going to be a lot of mistakes, and we're never going to really be able to reach it properly. Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite, was a medieval mystic. He wrote as though he was Dionysius, who heard St. Paul preaching at the Areopagus in Athens. We now know this is not true, so he is the pseudo-Areopagite. Pseudo-Dionysius took an extreme apophatic view. He was empathetic that God is utterly transcendent and ineffable, therefore he cannot be conceptualized by the human mind. Pseudo-Dionysius also wrote about the state of affirmation. The source of this knowledge is the Bible. However, such knowledge is within the limitations of human understanding and is symbolic. Okay, so he believed that so the Bible is like a written representation of what God is. But because we're confined to the human language and the human experience, we can't necessarily fully understand what God is exactly, because even what the Bible's saying, because it's just like, I guess you can compare the Bible to a mediator between us and God. It has the words in it, but like I was saying before, the words can only take us so far. They can't take us the whole way, because language is confined to this experience on earth. And yeah, I don't know. However, such knowledge within the limitations of human symbolic. Yeah. So the fact that it's symbolic is it acts as a pointer. Like I was saying, I guess you could say mediator as well. It's like a signpost pointing to the transcendent, but never. It's not explaining what he is. It's just a sign pointing to him. Dionysius also emphasized the metaphorical character of the language, which leads people to greater spiritual awareness. Hick argues that Dionysius tries to have it both ways by seeing God as beyond knowledge and yet revealed. Okay, so what does he mean by revealed? Okay, so I guess he's revealed in that he's in that we have some knowledge of him, in that we have the Bible, and that we have different symbols which are able to point us to God. Therefore, he must be revealed in some sort of way, in one way or another. But then he says God is beyond knowledge. Therefore, he can't be completely beyond knowledge. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be able to conceptualize of him at all. We wouldn't even have an idea that there was a God. So he's not completely beyond knowledge, and I guess this is a contradiction that Hick's pointing out here with Dionysius. He's saying that God is completely beyond knowledge yet revealed. He can't be both of those things at the same time, because it's a contradiction in terms. Okay. In many ways, it is curious that those who have the most powerful experiences of God seem least able to say anything about God. The strongest impression seems to be that God is a mystery beyond our words and concepts. Okay, on here I raises questions about knowledge. Okay, so what exactly does it mean to know something? Because there's a difference between knowing something and knowing of something. Perhaps the majority of people who feel able to say something about God are just regurgitating what they've heard from other people. Whereas the people who have had powerful religious experiences, they've had a taste of what the transcendent actually is, therefore they know how inexplicable he is, therefore they are even more unable to conceptualize and speak of this being to other people, so they say less about him. I guess that makes sense. How useful is the Negativa? Okay, well, scratch that last bit. That was a task we did in lesson. Okay, so there was a guy called Maimonides. He was around from 1135 to 1204 AD, and he wrote this example about a ship, and he basically used the via negativa and he applied it to a ship, by saying, well, he said it's not a mineral, it's not a plant, it's not a body, it's not a flat object, it's not a sphere, it's not pointed, not equilateral, not solid, has no space inside it. So these were all the things that, well, it was several different people he portrayed saying these things. Each person said one thing, and it was like, eventually, if you put all these together, he figured that you would clearly come to the idea that what he was talking about was a ship. However, could you not have easily come to many other conclusions based on those definitions, like a coffin or a wardrobe or something else which also didn't share those attributes? You could also argue that it's not very practical. It's not a very practical way of trying to find out what something is. It's like it's sort of like weaving your way along to something when you could just go in a straight line and get straight to the point. Yeah. But I think it's also interesting that he used different people as holding a different piece of information about what the thing was. Because I guess it represents, well, this might be sort of splitting some hairs here, but it could represent the fact that not everyone knows all of the things about God or what God isn't, but by taking multiple accounts from multiple people, we're almost able to come to the answer. I don't know, that might not be completely correct, but yeah. And also you can criticise this example because we already know beforehand that he's talking about a ship. Therefore, we come to that conclusion because he's told us that that's what conclusion we should come to. Yeah. And also, there's another criticism, is like, well, can you really compare God to a ship? Because, I don't know. God isn't a ship, is he? He exists. He's not material. He exists beyond this world. So can you really compare God to anything in this world? But then, if you can't do that, then can we really get any understanding? And I guess what he's doing here is just trying to represent the Negativa, and he's not necessarily saying that the ship is God. He's just using it as a means of trying to get to, or get the point across of, yeah, that you can sort of understand something a little bit better without jumping straight to the point. And another criticism would be that it goes against the Jewish scriptures of God, where they really only explain him with positive attributes, or at least that's what I've got wrote here. Yeah. 23 minutes. Okay. Should we try to talk about God positively or negatively? And what I've said is basically we should use multiple different means of explanation when trying to understand God, because, well, I don't think just the via negativa is good, because the way you can just criticize it and say, well, you could just easily arrive at nothing rather than God. So I think it's important that you do include some use the via positiva as well, in order so that God actually has some attributes. But then we also have to sort of take those with a grain of salt, because language isn't adequate in explaining what God is. Yeah, so I don't know. It seems simpler to talk about God as not anything bodily. God is not physical nor material. If God is the source of the universe, he cannot be something bodily, since anything bodily is part of the universe, and cannot therefore account for there being a universe. Only something of the universe, or only something which is not a body could account for there being a universe of physical objects. Okay, so this links to the cosmological argument and contingency, and everything within the universe is dependent on something else. Everything material is dependent on something else for it to become into existence. So if you trace that back far enough, then it was like, well, what brought matter into the world into the first place? It must have been some sort of transcendent being which wasn't necessarily material. But then obviously you can criticize that and say, well, could that not easily be a deistic being who's not really interested in us, sort of like an Aristotelian prime mover? And that's a possibility. Why would that God want us to keep on worshipping him? But I think it does make sense that if you arrive at the logical conclusion that perhaps a God did create this universe, and a lot of people start to believe that, then I guess it's within our nature to want to know exactly what that being is, and if that being is still around, and the possibility of that being still around, and also that being probably didn't just create a material world, but he probably wrote some sort of ethics into the structure of our universe as well, and logic, such as, well, I guess you can look at the logos, which is like the underlying logical structure which seems to hold our world together. Yeah, I don't know, it's pretty interesting stuff to speculate, but at the end of the day, we don't know. Yeah, there's like no proof for it, but it seems difficult to say that you can only talk significantly about God by negation. Yeah, exactly, it does. Because when you're just talking about something's negative attribute, something that something isn't, you never say what it is. When you're just talking about the Via Negativa or the Apothatic way, you never say what it is. Like, an example's going to come up in a minute, but you could say, you could use it, you could apply this to anything and be talking about nothing. I don't know. Right. Saying only what something is not gives no real indication of what it actually is. If one can only say what God is not, one cannot understand him at all. We can come to make true statements by means of negation. It is, for example, true to say the moon is not a piece of cheese, and sometimes we can guess what something is when someone denies only one thing about it. For example, in this case, we can know that he's talking about the moon because he says the moon is not a piece of cheese. Therefore, you know that he's talking about the moon, but yeah, I think so anyway. And sometimes we can guess what something is when someone only denies one thing about it. For example, if a mother who has just given birth is told it's a boy, it's not a boy, she will know at once that her baby is a girl. Yet it still remains that, except in rather special cases, if we know only what something is not, we do not know what it is. Suppose I say that there is something in my room, and suppose I reject every suggestion you make as to what is actually there. In that case, you will get no idea at all about what is in my room. Going back to Maimonides, it is simply wrong to say that someone who has all the negations mentioned in it has almost arrived at the correct notion of a ship. Such a person could equally be thinking of a wardrobe or a coffin. Okay. People who talk about God do not normally want to talk about him only in negations. They usually want to say that some things are definitely true of him. They make positive affirmations about God. They say, for example, God is the creator, God is powerful, God is knowledge, God is everywhere, God is eternal, God is good. These are normally understood to be positive attributes. As Aquinas dryly puts it, when people speak of the living God, They do not simply want to say that he differs from a lifeless body. Rigid reliance on negation, via Negativa or the Apothatic way, certainly has its disadvantages. Okay. Wait. Okay, I'll finish off part 1 there, and then I'll go on to part 2 a little bit later on. Because yeah, there's still quite a bit of this booklet left to do, and I'm not really too far through it. Anyway, thank you for watching.